It was a tranquil Thursday afternoon in St. Mary Mead, that small and charming English village, where time seemed to move at the pace of a gentle grandfather clock. The air was crisp with the promise of early autumn, and the hedgerows bordering the lanes were dotted with the first russet leaves. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary day, the milkman making his rounds, the postmistress sorting letters in the small village shop, and the church bell chiming 2 o'clock with its usual sleepy rhythm. But, as Miss Jane Marple often remarked, evil is seldom absent for long, it simply disguises itself as something quite respectable. And so, as she adjusted her spectacles and looked out over her garden, where the dahlias stood proudly against the waning sun, Miss Marple was far from suspecting that within a matter of days, her village would be gripped by scandal, suspicion, and, yes, death. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Griselda Clement, had organized a suing bee in aid of the St. Mary Mead Church Roof Fund. It was to be held in the parish hall, a charming if slightly draughty building that had witnessed everything from harvest suppers to amateur dramatics. Invitations were extended to all the ladies of standing, as the vicar's wife phrased it, and naturally, Miss Marple's name topped the list. "I thought we might do something useful, dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement had said with her usual briskness, "and perhaps a touch of fun, embroidery, needlepoint, that sort of thing. And of course, a few refreshments. I dare say it will draw quite the crowd." Indeed it did. The village was abuzz. The suing bee would feature a raffle, a display of handmade quilts and, most thrillingly, a demonstration by Mrs. Hermione Banbury Fletcher, a noted society lady recently come to reside at the old rectory. Rumor had it she had once been presented at court, and though she never said much about her past, it was whispered that her late husband had connections in government. She was glamorous, confident and just a touch condescending, all of which made her a magnet for gossip. Miss Marple, for her part, was more interested in her embroidery than in society rumors. Yet even she could not help noticing the subtle tensions that rippled beneath the polite chatter when Mrs. Banbury Fletcher entered a room. The suing bee began under a rosy light filtering through the high windows of the parish hall. The air smelled faintly of lavender sachets and tea biscuits. A dozen women were seated at long tables, busy with needles, fabrics and conversation. Miss Marple sat quietly near the end, her nimble fingers deftly stitching a cross pattern on linen. Around her, the women chatted as they worked, and as always in St. Mary Mead, gossip came as naturally as breathing. At one table sat Mrs. Emily Cartwright, the baker's widow, a stout woman with a fondness for others' business. Beside her was Irene Topping, a timid young housemaid who blushed at the mention of her employer, Connell Sedgwick, an aging but distinguished man whose wife was often away visiting relatives, as the village politely put it. At another table Mrs. Banbury Fletcher presided like a queen bee, her gloved hands more suited to pearls than pins. She was accompanied by Mrs. Mildred Pike, the schoolmistress, a woman of severe countenance and even severe opinions, and Nora Weatherby, a shy, plain woman who ran errands for the church and never seemed to fit in anywhere. It was during the second cup of tea that the tension began to build. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher, her voice ringing clear above the gentle hum, remarked rather pointedly, "Of course, quality workmanship can't be expected from everyone. Some of us, after all, weren't brought up to appreciate fine things." There was a faint rustle, the sound of needles pausing midair. Mrs. Pike pursed her lips. "I do hope, Mrs. Banbury Fletcher, that skill is not determined by breeding," she said primly. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's painted lips curved in a faint smile. "Oh, I didn't mean you, my dear," she purred. "But surely you must agree. One can tell the difference between a lady's work and a servant's." A poor Irene Topping's face flushed scarlet, and she bent over her embroidery to hide it. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, made a mental note. There was something in Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's tone, the calculated cruelty of it, that struck her as not merely unkind, but dangerous. By 4 o'clock, the suing bee had reached its cheerful climax. A raffle was drawn. Mrs. Cartwright won a basket of preserves, and the vicar's wife thanked everyone for their efforts. The air was warm with laughter and the scent of Earl Grey. And then, as the group began to pack away their sewing, something quite unexpected occurred. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher, who had risen to collect her handbag, swayed slightly. Her face blanched, and she pressed a hand to her throat. "Oh dear, I feel—" She never finished the sentence. She collapsed, the delicate china cup in her hand shattering as it struck the floor. For a few terrible seconds, the hall was filled with confusion. Mrs. Clement cried out, Fetch Dr. Haydock! Quickly. While Miss Marple knelt beside the stricken woman, her calmness a quiet contrast to the chaos. But even before the doctor arrived, Miss Marple knew. The stillness of the body, the bluish tinge to the lips, they spoke volumes. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher was dead. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, summoned by a frantic messenger boy. His examination was brief, and his expression grave. I'm afraid she's gone. Sudden, by the look of it. Heart, perhaps, or shock. But, he paused, frowning at the half-empty teacup on the table. Strange, there's a peculiar odor. Faint, but chemical. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed his gaze. Indeed, she murmured softly. It's not the usual scent of Earl Grey, is it? A silence fell. Around them, the women stared in horror. The cheerful afternoon now transformed into a tableau of dread. The police arrived shortly thereafter, led by Inspector Craddock, a competent and good-natured man who had long since learned to value Miss Marple's intuition. He took statements, examined the tea service, and ordered that the hall be closed for the evening. But even as he moved about briskly, clipboard in hand, Miss Marple could sense the undercurrents. Mrs. Pike, outwardly composed, could not conceal her satisfaction, though she tried. Irene Topping was trembling uncontrollably, refusing to look at anyone. Mrs. Cartwright was weeping and crossing herself, and Nora Weatherby, that mousy, overlooked creature, was watching everything with a strange, furtive intensity. Miss Marple, from her corner, sipped a cup of water thoughtfully. There were, she reflected, too many emotions for a mere accident. Later that evening, as twilight deepened over the village, Miss Marple sat by her hearth in her neat little sitting room. The clock ticked gently, and the fire glowed with comforting warmth. But her mind was far from calm. Poison, she said softly to herself. Almost certainly poison. She glanced at the small notebook she kept beside her chair, where she recorded curious happenings in St. Mary Mead, for future reference. There she wrote Mrs. Hermione Banbury Fletcher collapsed at Suing B. Possible poisoning. Teat. 4 witnesses of interest: Mrs. Pike resentment, Irene Topping humiliation, Mrs. Cartwright envy, gossip, Nora Weatherby's odd behavior. She paused, tapping her pencil. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added human nature rarely changes. The setting, however, does. She closed the notebook with a sigh. Somewhere in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, someone had brewed not just tea, but murder, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. The following morning dawned with deceptive calm. Sunlight spilled across the thatched rooftops of St. Mary Mead, glinting on dewdrops that clung to the hedgerows, and a soft mist curled lazily around the churchyard yews. From the outside, the village appeared utterly peaceful, a postcard image of English serenity. But beneath that calm veneer, tongues wagged, rumors flew, and speculation bloomed like weeds after rain. At the small post office, Mrs. Hartnell whispered to anyone who would listen that Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had been poisoned with cyanide, just like in those dreadful detective stories. At the butcher's, old Mr. Tompkins confided that he'd always said she was a troublemaker. Even at the vicarage, poor Mrs. Clement was so shaken that she mislaid half the parish letters. Only one person in the village seemed calm, Miss Jane Marple. She sat in her neat parlour, reading the Times while a small kettle whistled gently on the hob. Her mind, however, was far from the newspaper's headlines. It was busily sorting through the events of the previous day, arranging them, as she would her skeins of embroidery thread, into a clear and orderly pattern. The visit from Inspector Craddock at precisely 10:30. There came a brisk knock on the door. Miss Marple looked up, folded her newspaper, and smiled faintly. "Come in, Inspector. You're rather punctual this morning." Inspector Craddock, tall and broad-shouldered, removed his hat politely as he entered. "You've a way of knowing these things, Miss Marple," he said, a touch sheepishly. "Yes, I've been sent by the Chief Constable to follow up. The coroner's report came in early this morning." Miss Marple gestured toward the fireside chair. "Do sit down, Inspector. I'll fetch some tea. I dare say we both need it." A few moments later, as steam curled from the cups, Craddock consulted his notes. "The cause of death," he began, "was confirmed as digitalis poisoning, a large dose, concentrated, taken orally. There's no doubt it was in her tea." "Digitalis," repeated Miss Marple softly. "Derived from the foxglove plant, if I recall. Not uncommon in village gardens, and easily misused if one knows what one is doing." "Precisely. Dr. Haydock uses it for heart patients in minute doses, but this was deliberate. Murder, not mistake." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "So it was in her own cup, not in the pot?" Craddock nodded. "Her cup alone. The others who drank the same tea are perfectly fine. Murmured Miss Marple. That suggests a targeted intention. Someone prepared that cup specially, perhaps swapped it, or tampered when no one was looking. Tell me, Inspector, who poured the tea? Craddock flipped through his notebook. Mrs. Clement herself. She insists she served each cup directly from the pot. But Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's cup had been sitting beside her while she spoke with Mrs. Pike. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah yes, Mrs. Pike. She's a woman of admirable discipline, and rather fixed views about class and propriety. She didn't take kindly to Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's little barbs yesterday, I noticed. The inspector raised an eyebrow. You saw that, did you? One doesn't need to see, Miss Marple replied serenely. One simply listens. Human tempers are as audible as thunder before rain. The first interview, Mrs. Mildred Pike. Miss Marple decided her first call should be on Mrs. Pike. The schoolmistress lived in a modest brick house near the green, with lace curtains drawn at perfect right angles and a brass knocker polished to within an inch of its life. When Miss Marple arrived, Mrs. Pike was correcting a pile of exercise books. She looked up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Miss Marple, I suppose you've come about that dreadful business yesterday. I can assure you, I've already given my statement to the police. Oh, I don't doubt it, dear, Miss Marple said soothingly, removing her gloves. But sometimes it's easier to speak in comfort rather than in officialdom. May I sit? Reluctantly, Mrs. Pike gestured to a stiff-backed chair. If you must, though I've little to add. Miss Marple smiled kindly. You were seated beside Mrs. Banbury Fletcher, were you not? Yes, said Mrs. Pike crisply. Quite by accident, I assure you. I find that woman's manners lacking. All that talk of breeding and refinement. I told her plainly that a lady is known by her conduct, not her connections. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. A very sound principle. Mrs. Pike sniffed. Still, it's dreadful, of course. I don't condone unkindness, not even to her sort. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she seem uneasy before she collapsed? Mrs. Pike hesitated. Uneasy? No, triumphant if anything. She'd just been making some remark to poor Irene Topping, something cutting, about her position in service. I dare say she enjoyed upsetting the girl. Quite heartless. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. And yet you defended Irene. Mrs. Pike colored slightly. Someone had to. I won't have my pupils, or former pupils, spoken of as if they were dirt. I taught Irene her letters, you know. She's a good, simple soul. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she cast a gentle glance around the room. Everything was neat, efficient, yet cold. You must find it difficult, she remarked lightly, keeping discipline among children when the world so often lacks it among adults. Mrs. Pike gave a sharp little nod. Quite. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful. As she stepped back into the crisp air, Miss Marple reflected. Mrs. Pike was proud, certainly, but not malicious. Her anger was moral, not personal, hardly the sort to commit murder, unless provoked beyond reason. Still, it was too soon to dismiss anyone. The second interview. Irene Topping lived in the servants' quarters of Sedgwick Hall, a grand but fading estate on the edge of the village. Miss Marple walked up the gravel path, her walking stick tapping rhythmically. She was met at the side entrance by a pale, nervous young woman wringing her hands in her apron. Oh, Miss Marple, Irene gasped. I've been so frightened. They say she was poisoned, and I was sitting right there. Miss Marple patted her arm. Now, my dear, no one's accusing you of anything. Sit down and tell me quietly what you remember. Inside the small kitchen, Miss Marple accepted a cup of weak tea while Irene spoke in tremulous bursts. She, Mrs. Banbury Fletcher. She was awful to me, ma'am. Always was, from the moment she came to the village. Said I didn't know how to hold a needle properly. Yesterday, she called me a common girl. Right in front of everyone! I wanted to cry. Miss Marple's eyes were full of sympathy. And what did you do, child? I just kept stitching, ma'am. But Mrs. Pike stood up for me, said breeding don't make a lady. That shut her up for a bit. Then she went to fetch more tea, said Miss Marple quietly. She poured her own cup. I think so, ma'am. I wasn't looking properly, but when she came back, she had it in her hand. She took a sip, and then she said her heart felt queer. I thought she was being dramatic. She often was. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, I imagine she enjoyed her little scenes. Do you think someone meant to hurt her, Miss Marple? Irene whispered. Miss Marple studied her trembling hands. My dear, people rarely mean to kill. They mean to teach a lesson, or make a point, or frighten, but sometimes they go too far. As she left the hall, Miss Marple's mind was turning rapidly. So Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher had poured her own tea. That complicated matters. It could mean the poison was slipped into her cup beforehand. Or perhaps she herself had chosen the wrong one. But there was something else. Irene had said Mrs. Pike defended her, and Nora Weatherby had been watching everything. The third interview. Nora Weatherby lived alone in a small cottage behind the churchyard, its garden overgrown and full of nettles. She was a woman perpetually overlooked. The sort one might mistake for a shadow at the edge of the room. Miss Marple found her mending a torn sleeve, her thin fingers trembling. "Miss Marple," she said nervously, "I didn't expect visitors." "I thought you might appreciate one," said Miss Marple gently. "You were at the sewing bee, I believe." "Yes, ma'am." Nora's eyes darted to the window. "Terrible thing. What happened?" "Terrible." "You knew Mrs. Banbury Fletcher well?" "Oh, I wouldn't say well," Nora murmured. "She came to church sometimes, though she never stayed for the tea afterwards. Said it was too provincial. But I used to do small errands for her. Fetch her mending, that sort of thing." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did she pay you fairly?" A pause. "Sometimes," Nora said slowly. "Sometimes she said she'd forgotten her purse. Once she told me I should be grateful for the opportunity. Said I was lucky to be noticed at all." And Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "How very unkind. She wasn't nice, Miss Marple," Nora said suddenly, her voice shaking. "She had a cruel tongue. She knew things about people. Things she shouldn't know. She threatened to tell once, about Mrs. Pike and that letter, and about Colonel Sedgwick's maid." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What letter, my dear?" Nora hesitated, twisting her hands. "Oh, I shouldn't say. It was private. But Mrs. Pike once wrote something foolish years ago, when she was engaged. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher found out and teased her. Said she'd read it aloud at the sewing bee if she wasn't careful." "Blackmail, in a manner of speaking," said Miss Marple quietly. Nora nodded miserably. "I thought she was joking, but Mrs. Pike went white as a sheet." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and left. Outside, she stood for a long while beneath the arching yews, her eyes distant. A motive, perhaps, humiliation avoided, reputation protected. But that was only one thread. Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had insulted, manipulated, and meddled with nearly everyone in that hall. There were too many threads, and one of them had tightened around her neck. The fourth interview, Mrs. Emily Cartwright. Mrs. Cartwright was easy to find. She was already at the bakery, lamenting that death was dreadful but business must go on. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, pressing a currant bun into her hand before lowering her voice confidentially. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, that woman had it coming. Oh, not death, of course, but a bit of a shock might have done her good. She was far too free with her opinions." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Opinions about whom, Mrs. Cartwright?" "Well, about everyone," Mrs. Cartwright said eagerly. "She told me straight to my face that my pastry crust was vulgar, and she said Irene Topping was too pretty to be a servant. Can you imagine? Poor girl's terrified now. And then she hinted that Mrs. Pike had once been, well, involved with someone unsuitable. You know how she was?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed I do." Mrs. Cartwright lowered her voice, and the way she carried on at the sewing bee, drawing attention, always the center of the room. Some said she was writing a memoir too, about her society days. Imagine, a book full of names and scandals. I shouldn't wonder if someone wanted to keep their name out of it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A most interesting observation, my dear. You do have an ear for whispers." Mrs. Cartwright beamed. "Oh, I hear everything, Miss Marple." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly, "and sometimes, hearing too much can be dangerous." Evening reflections. That evening, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlor, knitting with her characteristic serenity. Outside, the village street was quiet. Only the faint hoot of an owl broke the stillness. Her mind replayed the day's conversations like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Mrs. Pike, proud but wounded by old shame. Irene, humiliated but innocent seeming. Nora, fearful and poor, with knowledge too heavy for her. Mrs. Cartwright, gossiping but shrewd. And somewhere between them all, a teacup laced with death. Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, "So many threads, but all from the same fabric." Her cat purred by the fire. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. "Digitalis," she mused aloud, "a gardener's poison, which means knowledge, deliberate choice." And Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had a garden full of foxglove, tended not by herself, but by her maid, or by whomever ran her errands. She paused, eyes narrowing. Yes, I think a visit to the old rectory is quite in order. Visit to the old rectory the next morning. Miss Marple walked up the gravel path to the late Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher's residence, the old rectory, a fine Georgian house with ivy climbing its walls, and an air of quiet superiority. Inspector Craddock was already there, directing constables as they searched the pantry and garden. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said with a resigned smile. "I suppose you've come to look at the foxgloves." "Only in the name of horticultural curiosity," she replied mildly. Craddock gestured toward the garden beds. "There's enough digitalis here to poison a regiment." But the bottles we found in her cabinet were untouched. Whoever administered the dose had access and knowledge. Miss Marple bent to inspect the plants, her gloved hand brushing the leaves. "These were cut recently," she observed, "and see here, traces of soil on the path, but not from boots, likely from a basket." For Craddock frowned. "A basket? For carrying flowers, or errands?" Miss Marple said softly. "Nora Weatherby often carried one. She fetched Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's mending, you recall." Craddock nodded. "She's on the list, but she seems harmless." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Inspector, so do most murderers, until you understand what pushed them." A quiet realization as Miss Marple returned home, a memory surfaced. Something Nora had said. She had a cruel tongue. She threatened to tell about Mrs. Pike and that letter. But Nora had also mentioned doing errands for her. Perhaps fetching tea from the shop. Perhaps even preparing it. A cruel woman who mocked and withheld payment, a frightened woman who feared exposure, and a community too polite to intervene. It was, Miss Marple thought, the perfect storm. She set her teacup down and smiled faintly. "Human nature," she murmured, "always the same, whether in a great city or a tiny village." Then she rang for tea, her eyes thoughtful. The truth, she felt, was very near indeed. The following Sunday was heavy with mist, a damp, grey morning that seemed to smother the village under a soft shroud. The church bells of St. Mary Mead tolled mournfully, echoing across the green where a few villagers gathered in quiet conversation. Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher's death, though whispered about endlessly, had now reached that peculiar stage in village life when tragedy becomes routine. There was talk of flowers for her grave, of whether she would be buried by the Cunninghams, or beside her late husband. But no one, not one soul, spoke of her kindly. Miss Marple, sitting primly in her pew, observed it all. She noticed the stiff set of Mrs. Pike's shoulders, the anxious eyes of Irene Topping just behind her, and the pale, drawn face of Nora Weatherby, who avoided everyone's gaze. When the final hymn ended and the vicar gave his blessing, Miss Marple lingered by the church gate, her delicate hands clasped over her prayer book. She knew that time and silence had their uses. People spoke more freely when they thought the worst was past. And sure enough, before the congregation had even dispersed, whispers reached her sharp ears. The gossip unfolds. Mrs. Cartwright, bustling out with her hat askew, was telling Mrs. Hartnell in confidential tones, "They say the police found letters, real scandalous ones, in that Banbury Fletcher woman's writing desk. Letters to some man in London. And one of them mentioned Mrs. Pike by name." Miss Marple turned, her face composed but her mind instantly alert. Letters. So the late Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had been writing something, perhaps her memoirs, or something even more damaging, and Mrs. Pike's name appearing in them was not a coincidence. As Miss Marple walked home along the misty lane, she considered the possibilities. Blackmail, pride, shame, fear, all motives with long and bitter roots. A visit from Inspector Craddock that afternoon brought another visitor to her cottage. Inspector Craddock looked more rumpled than usual, his collar undone, his notebook thick with scribbles. "Miss Marple," he began warily, "you've heard, no doubt, we found some personal letters at the old rectory." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One doesn't live in St. Mary Mead without hearing everything twice over, Inspector." He laughed despite himself and handed her a sheet of paper. "This is an excerpt. Seems our late Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had a talent for collecting people's secrets. Mentions Mrs. Pike's youthful indiscretions, Colonel Sedgwick's indelicate conduct, and something rather curious about a will." "A will?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "How interesting." "Yes. Apparently Mrs. Banbury Fletcher was executor of an estate belonging to a cousin in Sussex. Quite a tidy sum involved. But here's the odd bit. We can't find any legal papers, just gossip." Miss Marple leaned back thoughtfully. "So she held information, Inspector. not for justice, but for power. That sort of woman never uses knowledge for kindness. Craddock nodded grimly. We've no shortage of suspects with cause to hate her, but none with access to the digitalis, unless you count the gardener. And he's got an iron alibi. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Ah, but there's more than one way to gain access, Inspector. You might ask yourself, who fetched things for her, who knew the household's little habits? Nora Weatherby again, he asked. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, but don't hurry. Murder, like embroidery, reveals its pattern only with patience. A mysterious break in the following night brought an unexpected disturbance. At precisely 9:30, Miss Marple was finishing her evening tea when a frantic knock rattled her door. On opening it, she found Irene Topping, pale, breathless, her shawl half slipping from her shoulders.
"Oh, Miss Marple!
Someone's broken into Mrs. Banbury.
Fletcher's house!"
"The police are there already. Inspector Craddock said to fetch you." Miss Marple rose at once, her face calm though her pulse quickened. "Fetch my coat, dear. Quickly." They hurried through the fog-bound lanes to the old rectory, where a constable stood by the gate, lantern in hand. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, and the front door hung open. Inside, Inspector Craddock was directing his men with a grim expression. "The desk's been rifled," he said when Miss Marple entered. "Drawers pulled out, papers scattered, but whoever did it knew exactly what to take. All the letters are gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "How very convenient." He nodded. "And here's another curious thing. No sign of forced entry. Whoever came in had a key." Miss Marple's mind turned swiftly. A key implies familiarity. A friend, or servant. Craddock frowned. Nora Weatherby again. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps. But there's something about Nora I can't quite settle. She's frightened, yes, but not wicked. I think she's hiding knowledge, not guilt." She stepped closer to the desk, her keen eyes scanning the scattered papers. Then she saw it. A small torn scrap of lavender paper, caught beneath the leg of a chair. She bent, retrieved it, and examined it carefully. On it was written, in Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher's elegant hand. Threatened to expose her if she didn't pay. Must keep letter safe. Pike cannot ever. The rest was torn away. Miss Marple handed it to Craddock. "There, Inspector. That answers one question and raises another." Mrs. Pike paid her silence, perhaps, or refused to. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Then someone silenced her permanently. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But don't assume it was Mrs. Pike herself. Pride is one thing, murder, quite another." The confession that wasn't. The next day dawned bright and brittle. The kind of morning that makes deceit harder to conceal. Miss Marple was just finishing her porridge when there came another knock. This time, it was Mrs. Pike herself, her normally composed face pale and drawn. "I must speak to you, Miss Marple," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "I can't bear this much longer." "Sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You look exhausted." Mrs. Pike clasped her gloved hands tightly. "I didn't kill her, but I hated her. She knew something about me. Something I wrote when I was young. A foolish letter to a man who didn't deserve it. She found out, somehow. Said she'd tell the school board, ruin me. I went to see her 2 days before the suing bee. I begged her to destroy the letter. She laughed. Her voice cracked. I could have killed her then. But I didn't." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the day of the suing bee, I ignored her. I told myself she wasn't worth my dignity. But when she collapsed, oh, Miss Marple, I thought perhaps I'd wished it into being." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "My dear, wishing and doing are very different things. The fact that you feel guilt suggests you're not the one who acted." Mrs. Pike shuddered. "Then who did?" Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Someone who feared exposure even more than you, or who pitied those humiliated by her cruelty." A revelation from Irene that afternoon. Irene Topping returned. This time calmer, but oddly resolute. She stood in Miss Marple's parlor twisting her apron. "I've remembered something, Miss Marple," she said. "Something strange from the day of the suing bee." "Go on, my dear." "Well, just before we started the raffle, Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher said she'd left her gloves behind. She asked Nora to fetch her handbag from the side table. Nora brought it over, and Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher took out a little tin, said it was her heart medicine. She always took it with tea." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A tin, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. A small silver one." She took it from her bag, opened it, then shut it again quickly when Mrs. Pike asked what it was. "Said she didn't like questions." Did anyone else touch the bag? I don't think so, except Nora. She was the one who fetched it. Miss Marple leaned back, deep in thought. Thank you, Irene. That's most enlightening. When the girl had gone, Miss Marple's fingers rested on her teacup, a silver tin, heart medicine. Digitalis' heart medicine, she reflected. Was it possible Mrs. Banbury Fletcher had poisoned herself? But no. The concentration had been far too high for accident. Someone had tampered with the contents. She thought of Nora. Loyal, timid Nora, fetching the handbag, handling the tin. Banbury Fletcher's taunting cruelty. It formed, if not proof, then pattern. The confrontation at dusk that evening. Miss Marple took her shawl and set out toward the churchyard, where Nora Weatherby was tending to the graves, as she often did at twilight. The autumn air carried the faint scent of damp earth and chrysanthemums. Nora, Miss Marple called softly. A chilly night for gardening. Nora looked up startled.
Oh, Miss Marple.
You frightened me. I'm sorry, my dear. I thought you might like some company. They walked among the stones in silence for a few minutes. Finally, Miss Marple said gently, You fetched Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's handbag that day, didn't you? Nora froze. Yes, ma'am, she asked me to. And you saw her take out a little tin? Her eyes flickered. I did. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but steady. Tell me, Nora, did you open it, before giving it to her? Nora's lips trembled. I didn't mean to. Truly I didn't. But I thought I'd just sprinkle a little powder in, not enough to kill, just enough to make her ill, to make her stop. Stop what, my dear? Hurting people, Nora cried suddenly, tears spilling down her face. She laughed at me, called me a thief, said I'd stolen a scarf she never paid me for. She said she'd tell everyone I was dishonest, and I'd lose all my little jobs.
I couldn't bear it, Miss Marple.
I thought, if she were frightened, she'd stop tormenting everyone. Miss Marple took her hand gently. And where did you get the powder? From Dr. Haydock's surgery. Nora sobbed. He'd prescribed it for my landlady last winter, Digitalis. She died and I still had the bottle. I didn't think it was poison, not really, just medicine. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Oh, my poor child, you didn't know how deadly it was. Nora shook her head miserably. I never meant to kill her. I only wanted peace. Miss Marple squeezed her hand. I believe you, but you must tell Inspector Craddock everything. I will, Nora whispered. I can't sleep, thinking of it. As the church clock struck 8, Miss Marple watched the weeping woman disappear down the path toward the constable's cottage. Her expression was sad but resolute. Such things, she murmured, begin with bitterness and end with tragedy. The unexpected twist, but even Miss Marple, wise as she was, had not foreseen one final twist. The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived looking astonished.
Miss Marple?
You'll never believe this. We've had the toxicology results back. The powder Nora admitted using was not the same Digitalis that killed Mrs. Banbury Fletcher. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Not the same. No. Different compound entirely. Much stronger. Nora's powder could have made her faint, but not killed her. Miss Marple's eyes lit with sudden clarity. Then someone else finished what Nora began.
Exactly.
But who? Miss Marple's mind was already racing. She saw again the suing bee, Mrs. Banbury Fletcher's taunts, the cups of tea, the handbags, the silver tin, and one more thing, the moral outrage of Mrs. Pike sitting beside her, watching, listening. Inspector, she said softly, tell me, was Mrs. Pike one of Dr. Haydock's patients? He checked his notes. Yes, as a matter of fact, mild heart trouble, prescribed Digitalis drops. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then, my dear Inspector, I think we have reached the heart of it. Miss Marple's reflection that night, as the village slept beneath a thin veil of fog. Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, her knitting needles gleaming in the lamplight. She had not yet told Craddock her full suspicion, that Mrs. Pike, on discovering Nora's foolish act, had quietly ensured that Mrs. Banbury Fletcher would not recover. Perhaps she'd done it in a moment of righteous fury, believing it a mercy for the others. Or perhaps out of fear that her own secret letter would still be revealed. Whatever the motive, Miss Marple knew the pattern was complete. She sipped her tea and murmured softly, one thread begins with cruelty, another with pride, and together, they weave a tapestry of death. Tomorrow she would tell Inspector Craddock everything. But tonight, she allowed herself one moment of quiet sadness. Even in St. Mary Mead, beneath all its roses and lace, the human heart was capable of the darkest embroidery. The dawn broke pale and still over St. Mary Mead, a fragile, uncertain light creeping through the mist like truth emerging after long deceit. A thin wisp of smoke rose from Miss Marple's cottage chimney as she sat alone, her teacup steaming, her knitting untouched. She had not slept, not after what she'd realized the night before. There was pity in her heart, yes, but also resolve. Some truths, she thought sadly, are better revealed by gentle hands, lest they cut too deep. At 9 o'clock sharp, a brisk knock came at the door. Inspector Craddock stood there, looking as though he'd aged a decade overnight. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said grimly. "I hope you've had some rest." "Not much, Inspector. I've been thinking about Mrs. Pike." Craddock sighed. "So have I. We've been over the records. She did indeed have access to a bottle of digitalis drops, said to have thrown it out months ago." "Did she, now?" Miss Marple murmured. "And did anyone see her do it?" He shook his head. "No." "Then, Inspector," she said softly, "perhaps it's time we had a little gathering. The village loves a gathering, and it so happens that Mrs. Hartnell has suggested a memorial tea for our poor departed Mrs. Banbury Fletcher. A fitting occasion, don't you think?" Craddock frowned, then nodded slowly. "You mean to?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "to let the truth unspool itself. In company." The memorial tea by 3 o'clock that afternoon, the vicarage parlour, was filled with villagers dressed in muted greys and mauves, their voices low but eager. The scent of lilac polish and sponge cake mingled with the faint rustle of morning creep. Mrs. Hartnell presided solemnly over the teapot, while Mrs. Pike sat rigidly near the window, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Nora Weatherby, pale but composed, had been released on Miss Marple's recommendation pending further inquiry. She poured tea quietly, her eyes lowered. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed place beside the hearth, her manner mild and grandmotherly as ever. But beneath that gentle exterior, her mind was sharp as a blade. Inspector Craddock, pretending casual interest, lingered by the bookshelf. The opening moves. Miss Marple waited until the cups were filled, and the first cautious sips taken before she spoke. "It's a kind thought, this little gathering," she said softly. "Mrs. Banbury Fletcher was, after all, a part of our community, though not, perhaps, its kindest part." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the room. "She did like to keep her information close, didn't she?" Miss Marple continued. "And to use it?" "Oh yes, when it suited her." Mrs. Pike's jaw tightened. "I suppose she thought it her duty to uphold standards." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Though sometimes in upholding one's standards, one tramples rather heavily upon others. Don't you agree, my dear Mrs. Pike?" Mrs. Pike flushed slightly. I do what I believe is right, Miss Marple." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "Just as you did that day at the Sewing Bee, when Mrs. Banbury Fletcher fainted. You were the first to call for help, weren't you?" Mrs. Pike looked startled. "Why, yes, I suppose I was. And you fetched her teacup afterward, I think?" "To see if she'd finished her drink." There was a small pause. "I may have," Mrs. Pike said hesitantly. "I can't quite remember." "Oh, but you were always observant," Miss Marple said sweetly. "You even noticed when Nora fetched the handbag from the side table. Quite near your own." A murmur passed through the group. Nora's trembling hands clinked against the teapot. Mrs. Pike's voice rose slightly. "Are you suggesting?" Miss Marple lifted a hand. No, my dear. Merely recalling how careful you always are with details. For instance, when you told the constable that you'd seen Mrs. Banbury Fletcher take a pill from a silver tin, though you couldn't have done, since you were pouring tea at the time." The room fell silent. Mrs. Pike's face blanched. You're mistaken." Miss Marple regarded her kindly but firmly. "I don't think so. You see, dear, I believe you went to her side not merely to assist, but to ensure that the contents of that little tin were never traced, because you knew what was in it." Inspector Craddock straightened subtly near the wall, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Pike. "The truth begins to unravel." Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried an undeniable authority. "Poor Nora confessed to adding a little of her landlady's medicine to the tin. A foolish act born of hurt pride. But the dose she added was harmless. What killed Mrs. Banbury Fletcher was a second, far stronger poison. One that could only have come from a medical bottle." She turned slightly toward Mrs. Pike. "A bottle such as the one prescribed to you." Pike's breath caught audibly. Her gloved hands trembled. I threw that bottle away." Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "You told us so. Yet Dr. Haydock's records show no new prescription since." You still had it. And you still resented Mrs. Banbury, Fletcher, for what she knew. She ruined lives. Mrs. Pike burst out suddenly, her composure cracking.
She delighted in cruelty.
She mocked every good woman in this village, even those who trusted her. And she blackmailed me. There was a collective gasp. She threatened to send that wretched letter to the school governors. Mrs. Pike continued, her voice shaking. Said she'd see me dismissed, disgraced, that I was unfit to teach children because of one foolish mistake in my youth. I couldn't bear it. I meant only to frighten her, just enough to make her stop. Her voice faltered into silence. Miss Marple regarded her sadly. So you changed the contents of her medicine tin after Nora's little addition. You thought she'd already tainted it, and that no one would suspect another hand. Mrs. Pike covered her face. Yes, she whispered. I thought it would look like an accident. I told myself it was justice, that she deserved it for the misery she caused. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Pike, I must. But Miss Marple raised a hand gently. A moment, Inspector. She leaned toward Mrs. Pike, her voice low and compassionate. My dear, evil often begins in righteousness. You told yourself you were righting a wrong, but murder never rights anything. It only deepens sorrow. A tear slipped between Mrs. Pike's fingers. I know, she whispered. Every night since I've seen her face. The aftermath, when the police had quietly escorted Mrs. Pike from the vicarage, the remaining guests sat in stricken silence. Even Mrs. Hartnell, who normally had a phrase for every occasion, could find no words. Finally Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. I'm afraid there's little comfort to be found in such matters, she said softly. But perhaps some understanding. You see, wickedness seldom appears monstrous. More often, it's a small thing, a wound left untended, a bitterness fed too long. In Mrs. Pike's case, pride and humiliation became poison long before any digitalis did. No one replied. The ticking of the vicarage clock filled the silence. Miss Marple looked around the room with gentle eyes. We all like to think ourselves incapable of evil. But a village, like a heart, holds shadows in its corners. And so we must be kind, especially to those who seem least deserving of it. She gathered her shawl about her shoulders and departed quietly, leaving behind the murmurs of the chastened women. Epilogue. The quiet evening that night, St. Mary Mead was unusually still. The fog had lifted, revealing a waning moon above the rooftops. Miss Marple sat once again by her hearth, her knitting basket at her side. Inspector Craddock called just before 9, his face lined with fatigue. She's confessed, Miss Marple, he said simply. Everything you suspected. She'll face trial, though the court may show mercy. She's not in her right mind. But I must say, you were right from the start. I don't know how you do it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, it's not cleverness, Inspector. Only observation and memory. Human nature doesn't change much, whether in London or St. Mary Mead. Craddock nodded, glancing toward the fire. And Nora Weatherby. She'll be all right, Miss Marple said gently. I've arranged for her to take in some mending work from the vicar's sister in Eastbourne. She needs kindness, not condemnation. He smiled. You always think of the small mercies, don't you? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. They're the only ones that last. He tipped his hat and left her to the quiet. As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gazed into the flames. Outside, the village slept once more, its moral order restored, for now. And yet in her heart, she knew the truth. For every scandal silenced, another waited patiently to bloom. She sipped her tea and murmured softly to herself, human wickedness, like the weeds in a country garden. Pull one up, and another takes its place. The fire crackled softly, the night folded around her, and St. Mary Mead dreamed on serene, deceptive, eternal.